Hi, I'm Miss Mahan, and today I'm going to be discussing the chemistry of water. Now, water is extremely interesting because it has these amazing properties that allow life to happen. We're going to talk about how the structure of the water molecule leads to the function of water and how it can act in so many different ways and help living organisms so much. So if you take a look at this water molecule, you'll see that this red portion represents the oxygen, and the white portions here and the blue portions here represent the hydrogen. You'll also notice that there's this slight charge sign that notes a negative charge on the red side and a positive charge on this blue side, or a positive charge here where the hydrogens can be found. The hydrogen and oxygen are covalently bonded together. However, we call it a polar covalent bond because the oxygen is more electronegative, because it's larger, because it has more pull on the electrons. It pulls the electrons towards the oxygen more often. Because electrons are negatively charged, this portion then ends up with a slight negative charge. Because the hydrogen is giving up its negative charge most of the time, it ends up with a slight positive charge. Now you'll see that the resulting attraction between the negative side of the water molecule and the positive side of the water molecule creates this thing called a hydrogen bond. And when the water is linked together in the liquid form, those hydrogen bonds are constantly reforming and breaking, reforming and breaking. And that allows water to have some really cool properties. Let's discuss them. First of all, I wanted to discuss why we would even bother studying water. If we take a look, you can see that the inside of a cell is mostly water. But what's on the outside? The outside is actually mostly water too. So cells create a system that is separated from an outside fluid system. And this becomes really important later when they're trying to transport materials into and out of the cell. So far we've talked about the importance of water and how the structure of water relates to its function. The properties that come from the structure of water that allow life to happen would be the high specific heat, or the amount of energy that water can absorb before changing phase, its cohesive properties, its adhesive properties, and its ability to act as a solvent. All of those things are what help water maintain the balance, not just inside of our bodies, but in the entire biosphere. Now we talked all about those hydrogen bonds breaking and reforming, and I said that it makes it a sticky molecule. Well, that means that the water is sticking to itself. When water sticks to itself, we refer to that as cohesion. When water sticks to other things, we refer to that as adhesion. The cohesive properties of water allow it to have surface tension. So if you had a droplet of water on your desk and you tried to poke at it, you'd have to actually poke pretty hard in order to break through the surface of the water. That's important to many creatures on our planet, including this creature right here, the water skipper. The water skipper actually floats across the surface of the water. Many insects that rely on being in the fluid phase of water for its larval life and then its mature life being in the atmosphere, they need the surface tension of water in order to make the transition from their two life stages. In addition, adhesion allows water to stick to other molecules. Now, you can see the meniscus formed here in the graduated cylinder is caused by both cohesion and adhesion. Let's talk about that. So you have the adhesive properties of water that are allowing the water to slide and stick up on the sides of this glass tube. But it is the cohesive properties of water that then follow those first particles of water up the side, pushing it into a full arc of the meniscus. That same property that allows the water to climb the sides of this glass tube also help you when you're trying to drink from a straw. The capillary action of water, which is the movement of water up a tube due to those adhesive and cohesive properties, is actually how trees drink. So let's take a look at what's happening in a tree. If you look at the inside portion of a tree, you'll find that there are these tubes, and these tubes are part of the tree's vascular tissue. There's the xylem and there's the phloem. The xylem are the empty tubes that allow water to move up from the roots of the tree. So the roots have these areas where water can enter through osmosis into the membranes of the cells, and water droplets are then transported to the vascular tubes. But how is it that the water moves all the way from the bottom of the roots all the way up through the tree to the very top leaves? Well, that has to do with the same type of motion that you use on a straw. So think of those vascular tubes as hundreds of straws all bundled together. But also think about the force that would have to be exerted on that number of straws if you're trying to drink a soda. I know that that amount of force seems daunting, but if you have that force being spread out over hundreds and hundreds of leaves and or needles on the top of a tree, then that would be something that would be accomplishable. So if you're looking at a tree, you'll see that there's tons of leaves usually at the top of the tree. And from those leaves, the sun and the wind are going to cause transpiration. And if you remember, transpiration is tree sweating or tree perspiration. So the tree is going to sweat, and as the water evaporates, it's going to leave an empty space or create a suction. And all of those hundreds of suctions all across the leaves are going to slowly suck the water from the roots all the way up to the top of the plant. The polarity of water also leads to its ability to be a universal solvent. Now, what do we mean by universal solvent? What we mean is that it can dissolve almost everything, anything that's polar. And the solvent, or water in this case, is going to dissolve any solute, creating a solution. Now, water can do anything, can dissolve anything that has a positive and a negative charge. So that can be other polar molecules or other ions. And so we had talked about in class how ionic bonds are not extremely strong inside living organisms because they're filled with water. And the reason why is because when you have an ionic bond, you have a positive side and a negative side. And that means that water is able to wiggle-waggle its way in between. And you can see here that it's actually broken the ionic attraction between the sodium and the chlorine by the negative side of the ion being drawn to the positive sodium. So we have the negative oxygen here being drawn to the positive sodium, and we have the negative chlorine here attracting the positive hydrogen. And so because of that, they have substituted themselves for the ionic interaction that was holding the sodium and the chlorine together. And so now the sodium and the chlorine are broken apart and dissolved into the solution. Now, water will do just about the same thing with almost every single polar molecule that it encounters. In fact, anything that is polar, water can and will eventually dissolve. We have a saying in AP Biology, and that is that like likes like, which means that polar molecules like polar molecules and charged things like charged things. But uncharged things or non-polar molecules do not like polar molecules. We'll talk about that next. Would you say that this following molecule is polar or non-polar? Let's take a look. We've got a long string of carbons, and evenly distributed along the carbons are lots of hydrogen. We would say that these carbons are saturated with hydrogen atoms. And so because of that, and that equal dispersion of the positive and the negative, and these are sharing, by the way, covalent bonds, they're sharing, but the equal dispersion across the two sides are going to mean that one side is not more charged than another. Anytime you see a molecule that looks like this, that has long chains, and there's not a whole bunch of oxygens and other things like nitrogen and sulfur added on, you're going to know that you're looking at a nonpolar molecule. And if it's just carbon and hydrogen, you're going to know that you're looking at what we call a hydrocarbon. And hydrocarbons are never charged. So they're all nonpolar. Now some hydrocarbons that you might be familiar with would be butter, lard, or oils. And we know that those are repelled by water. In fact, we call those molecules hydrophobic molecules. And hydrophobic molecules are not something that water can dissolve. So that would be the exception to the rule. This picture depicts the three phases of water. Here you can see that there's a gaseous phase, which is on the far right. You can see the liquid phase, which is in the middle, and you can see the solid phase, which is on the far left. Now the solid phase, you can see there's big gaps in spaces because of the way that the polar molecules interact. When water freezes or goes into its solid form, it forms crystals, and those crystals need to have space. And because of that, the solid form of water is actually less dense than the liquid form, which allows for constant and close interaction. Even though there's hydrogen bonds forming and breaking, that interaction is constantly switching and changing and allowing them to pack closely together. Because of this unique arrangement of the molecules themselves, the ice, or its solid state, floats on top of the water. This drives oceanic currents. As the water approaches 4 degrees Celsius, its most dense temperature, it sinks, and that drives the underwater currents that we don't see. It also allows for turnover in stratified lakes. So as the warm water floats on top of the warm water, when it cools and approaches 4 degrees Celsius, it sinks, and that allows for nutrient distribution and temperature distribution that lakes need in order to stay nice and balanced. Water is an amazingly sticky molecule. It likes to stick to itself, and that means that it takes a lot of energy in order to unstick it from itself and move it into the next phase of matter. So it takes an enormous amount of energy to move it from a solid to a liquid state, and almost 100 degrees of a temperature change to move it from a liquid into the vapor state. This amount of energy is amazing and allows water to be an excellent insulator, which is extremely important not just for our planet, but for individual organisms. Because of this property, we say that water has a high specific heat, which means it takes a lot to heat it up, and it also takes a lot to cool it down. An excellent insulator. Water naturally dissociates into concentrations of hydrogen, or H+, and hydroxide, OH- ions. If the hydroxide ions equal that of the hydrogen ions, then water is neutral, or at a pH of 7. If the hydrogen ions are greater than that of the hydroxide ions, then the water is going to be acidic. If you add a base to water, then the hydroxide ions will increase, and this causes the water to be basic, or from 8 to 14. The concentration of hydrogen ions is how we determine pH. If you have a 10 to the 0 concentration, you have a pH of 0, and that would be a concentration of 1. If you have 10 to the negative 1 concentration, that's 0.1 concentration, or a pH of 1, and so forth. 10 to the negative 2 would be 0.01. So if you go from a pH of 0 to 2, it's not twice as strong, it's 100 times more strong. Buffer systems are special salt solutions that resist a change in pH, and because of that, they're used by biological systems to maintain homeostasis. Continue answering the questions, and thank you for exploring water with me today.